and welcome to Get Woke or Die Trying. I'm your host, Robin Turan. With the delayed 2020 Olympics just getting underway in Tokyo, I wanted to talk about something that has ruffled a lot of feathers. Sha'Carri Richardson's suspension and exclusion from the U.S. Olympic team after a positive test for THC, which is a component of marijuana, following her 10.8 seconds in the 100-meter dash, the third fastest time in the world this year among women. There has been an enormous public outrage at the decision of the Olympic Committee to leave her off the team, despite still being able to compete in the 4x100 relay, drawing nearly 600,000 signatures on a petition to let her compete, and Representatives Jamie Raskin and my girl, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of the House Oversight Committee's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, penning a letter to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, urging them to reconsider. But the key here is that this is not an isolated decision that occurred in a vacuum. This decision comes at the same time as Black athletes all over the world are being subject to discrimination, exclusion, bans, and more. Five-time world champion and reigning Olympic gold medalist Simone Biles is having skills valued incorrectly because they're not safe for other athletes. Two Namibian runners, Christine Mboma and Beatrice Maselingi, were disqualified for having naturally occurring testosterone levels that were considered too high. The governing body of track and field ruled that Caster Semenya of South Africa, two-time Olympic gold medalist in the 800, would be required to take hormones to lower her testosterone levels if she wanted to compete in women's sports, arguing that high naturally occurring levels of testosterone in athletes like Semenya with intersex characteristics that don't conform to standard definitions of male and female give them an unfair competitive advantage. And finally, the International Swimming Federation has banned swimmers from wearing soul caps, which are specifically designed to protect the natural hair of Black female swimmers, saying the caps do not fit the natural form of the head. It's abundantly clear that the common thread in all of these instances is race. And I don't know about you, but I have a hard time believing that's simply a coincidence. Racism and white supremacy in the U.S. are well documented, but anti-Blackness is clearly a pervasive sentiment worldwide. When it comes to Sha'Carri's case in particular, a lot of people have taken the side of, well, she broke the rules, so it's only fair. But I invite you to dig a little deeper. Is the enforcement of this rule applied fairly and consistently? Why is she being punished for using marijuana in a state where it's legal? Why is marijuana on the banned substances list if it's not a performance enhancer? Why is weed illegal in the first place? Let's dig a little deeper, starting at the beginning. Up until the early 1900s, there were no federal restrictions on the possession, consumption, or sale of cannabis in the U.S. Hemp, the fibrous part of the plant, was used for making clothes, paper, rope, and other objects. It was occasionally used medicinally, but recreational use was not widespread. It wasn't until it was popularized amongst Mexican immigrants that it really took off. In Spanish, the plant is known as marijuana, which is the origin of the modern word. America has long had xenophobic and anti-immigrant tendencies, and this was no exception. In the 1930s, anti-weed propaganda began to take hold, most notably a film called Reefer Madness. In the movie, teenagers smoke weed for the first time and become extremely violent and evil. This is also where the idea of marijuana as a gateway drug came from. The idea that using marijuana will make someone more likely to use harder drugs in the future. And let the record reflect, there's an extensive body of scientific research that has disproved that theory. The majority of people who use cannabis do not go on to experiment with or become addicted to other drugs or substances. Shortly after that propaganda film, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed so that cannabis sales could produce tax revenue. Once alcohol prohibition ended, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics shifted their focus to marijuana, driving the racism and xenophobia into high gear. The false narrative of weed smoking leading to violent and aggressive behavior was a stereotype applied to Black and Hispanic people. Fear-mongering continued to increase. What was long referred to as cannabis by English speakers was now almost exclusively called marijuana, linking it to the Mexican immigrants who popularized its recreational consumption. This was an early example of how stereotypes cause harm in real time. In the first year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, Black people and Mexican people were 3 and 9 times more likely, respectively, to be arrested for violating drug laws than whites, despite relatively equal usage across demographics. In 1952, legislation went into effect that established mandatory minimum sentences, especially for drug-related offenses. Interestingly enough, when weed smoking was extremely popular with white people during the hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s, they weren't met with the same consequences. Then enter the infamous war on drugs started by President Richard Nixon. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 declared drugs America's public enemy number one and made cannabis a Schedule I drug. Under this classification, drugs are considered to have a high potential for abuse or addiction and no accepted medical use. Other Schedule I drugs include heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. One of these things is not like the other. Notably, drug possession laws are much stricter when it comes to controlled substances. Penalties for Schedule I and Schedule II drugs are the harshest. The categorization of marijuana as a dangerous controlled substance and its subsequent criminalization is 1, not rooted in fact, and 2, disproportionately impacts people of color. According to a 2010 ACLU report, Black people were 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people, despite similar rates of consumption. Higher arrest and incarceration rates among Black and Latinx communities are not indicative of more drug use, just the increased presence of predatory law enforcement officers in low-income communities and communities of color. Discriminatory enforcement of drug laws is just another example of how police and law enforcement don't function to serve and protect as they would like you to think. They still operate as an extension of slave patrols, acting to uphold white supremacy and protect the rich ruling class. And not only are there gross disparities in arrests and convictions, sentencing varies drastically as well. In at least 15 states, Black men are imprisoned on drug charges 20 to 57 times more than their white counterparts. Sentences imposed on Black people are almost 20% longer than those of white people who committed the same offenses with comparable criminal histories. The United States has just a hair over 4% of the world's population, but accounts for a whopping 25% of the world's prisoners. Of said prisoners, 1 in 5 are incarcerated on drug offenses. That's close to 500,000 people any given day languishing in cells for nonviolent offenses. With all that being said, something that strikes me as painfully ironic and unfair is that in the year 2021, when upwards of 24 states have legalized marijuana and all but 13 permit its use for medical reasons, there are still hundreds of thousands of mostly Black and brown people in prison for the very same thing that white people are now getting rich off of. During the pandemic, at the height of lockdowns and widespread closure of businesses, dispensaries all across the country were still open to customers and even considered essential in some places. Meanwhile, countless people are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole for the same thing that is now legally bringing in billions of dollars of revenue. Since legal sales of cannabis began in 2014, states have collectively generated close to $8 billion in tax revenue. It can't go without saying that business owners in the legal cannabis industry are overwhelmingly white. It's clear that legalization and decriminalization aren't the full extent of justice. Justice would be releasing anyone incarcerated on marijuana-related charges, expunging their records, and ensuring that the revenue from what has previously torn countless families apart and ruined so many lives is invested in the communities that it's impacted the most, namely communities of color. One city in particular is leading the way on what this would look like. In Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, there is a reparations program for Black residents for what is described as harm caused by discriminatory housing policies and practices, as well as inaction on the city's part. The program is the first of its kind in the country with the goal of revitalizing, preserving, and stabilizing Black communities through home ownership, building generational wealth, and funding Black-owned businesses. The funding for the program would come directly from tax on the sale of recreational marijuana. Not only is there the possibility of funding reparations, but there are also numerous economic and other benefits of legalization. The economic impacts in the form of an enormous potential source of tax revenue have already been evident, but there is also huge potential for job creation in every step of the supply chain, from farming and cultivation to transporting it, dispensaries or pharmacological companies that can sell it, to the state or federal agencies that will be responsible for regulating it. A study conducted in Nevada predicted the creation of more than 41,000 jobs through the year 2024 and nearly $2 billion in income for the legal weed industry. Legalizing cannabis on the federal level could produce more than 1 million jobs by 2025, with it being one of the fastest growing industries nationwide. Although cannabis has been legalized in many states, it can still be difficult for investors to capitalize on this growth since it's not yet legalized federally. Legalization on the national level would allow cannabis companies to list their stocks on all of the U.S. exchanges and open up more opportunities for investors. In addition to money generated through revenue, legalization will also save billions of dollars in costs associated with the enforcement of prohibition laws. In 2013, before states' legalizations were more widespread, the ACLU reported that the federal government spent an average of $3.6 billion per year on enforcement. The number of court cases for related offenses would drop considerably, preventing hundreds of thousands from being incarcerated. States spend between $25,000 and $30,000 for each inmate every year, which results in several $billion per year that would not have to come out of taxpayers' pockets. Not to mention, the health benefits of cannabis can be fully explored if it's declassified as a Schedule I drug. Currently, in order for biomedical research to be conducted on Schedule I drugs, there is a rigorous approval process scientists must go through with the DEA. It can be extremely time-consuming and require expensive security protocols that delay or halt the process altogether. There is also only a small amount of lawfully available marijuana for researchers to take advantage of. The research is also not subject to federally funded grants. The refusal of the DEA to reschedule cannabis to Schedule II or a lower tier is a major roadblock in many reforms, especially for medical uses. Interestingly enough, there are other substances that are perfectly legal that are far more dangerous and have no accepted medical use, such as alcohol and tobacco. Alcohol is responsible for upwards of 88,000 deaths every year. Excessive drinking can cause liver, heart, pancreas, and brain damage, as well as contribute to several different types of cancer. Smoking tobacco is widely recognized as the leading preventable cause of death in the entire world. People who smoke regularly have an average life expectancy 10 years shorter than people who don't. The risks of lung cancer, heart disease, COPD, and other chronic conditions are well documented and exponentially more likely among tobacco smokers. About 70 of the chemicals in cigarettes are known carcinogens or cancer-causing agents. Not to mention, it's virtually impossible to overdose on cannabis, and it's very unlikely to be addictive. Now, I want to be clear, cannabis can have hallucinogenic effects and other properties that could be considered dangerous or harmful for someone under the influence, but as far as we know, the risks are not nearly as great compared to other substances, especially other Schedule I drugs. A Quinnipiac poll showed that 69% of Americans, including 62% of Republicans, believe that marijuana should be legal. And recently, Senate Democrats have responded to that by introducing legislation that would enact legalization of cannabis on the federal level. The bill also proposes expunging the criminal records of people incarcerated on nonviolent marijuana-related offenses, provide grants and funding for medical research, as well as allow cannabis companies to access essential financial services and remove hefty tax penalties that are currently in place. It also proposes transitioning oversight and regulation from the DEA to the FDA, which also has the regulators for alcohol and tobacco. Although passage is unlikely in an evenly split Senate, the growing support is encouraging. But I think the big picture here is that substance use and abuse are treated as criminal justice issues, but the reality is they're public health issues. Creating a cycle of incarceration may tackle the symptoms, but does nothing to address the root causes. Somewhere close to 65% of incarcerated people suffer from some kind of addiction or substance use disorder, but only a measly 11% of them receive any treatment while they're behind bars. As a result, they're likely to continue using upon their release and end up incarcerated yet again. Recidivism has more to do with a fundamentally flawed criminal justice system, not a so-called criminal's propensity to reoffend. Understanding this concept is what leads to the decision to decriminalize drugs across the board in places like Oregon and Portugal. Focusing on high-quality medical treatment and other social services has been shown to reduce rates of substance use disorders by 40 to 60%. It also has the potential to save billions of dollars that would otherwise be used housing inmates. Pivoting back to the issue of cannabis use among athletes, perhaps the most frustrating is the double standard that we see playing out in real time. When the U.S. Olympic Committee handed down Sha'Carri Richardson's 1-month suspension due to violation of the U.S. anti-doping agency policy, she was left off of the Olympic team. 1 month's time would have left her unable to compete in the 100-meter dash as the favorite to win, but she still would have been eligible for the 4x100-meter relay, in which she would have played a key role. Yet, they still decided to leave her off the team altogether. And while you would be right in saying that she broke a rule, the question is why? The medical director of the World Anti-Doping Agency co-authored a study in 2018 that found no evidence that cannabis has any performance-enhancing properties. WADA officials have rationalized keeping it on the banned substances list by citing government attitudes toward the drug, despite it being legal in more than 40 countries. All 4 of the major sports organizations in the U.S. have updated their policies in accordance with the prevalence of legalization, no longer suspending athletes for cannabis uses. So why can't the WADA follow suit? Several other Olympians came out in support of Sha'Carri, many of whom also smoked weed regularly, even before it was legal. Michael Phelps smoked weed dating back to at least 2009 and was seen on camera doing it, and was still able to compete, racking up the most Olympic medals in history. Usain Bolt, fastest man alive, also a frequent cannabis user. Ross Rabigladi won a gold medal in snowboarding in 1998, even after testing positive for THC. And pouring salt in the wound, a Forbes article was published only days ago saying cannabis takes the world stage at the Tokyo Olympics, featuring U.S. women's soccer star Megan Rapinoe explaining all about how she incorporates CBD into her training and recovery. Let me be clear. I fully support athletes taking full advantage of the many benefits of cannabis and its various properties, but the inconsistencies, picking and choosing who gets punished and who gets a free pass, just screams double standard. Good old white privilege. The way smoking weed is regarded in comparison to using CBD oil is reminiscent of the demonization of crack compared to cocaine, most of which is rooted in racism. And lastly, I just want to note, Sha'Carri smoked weed in a state where it was legal, after being unexpectedly informed about the death of her mother. And no one has the right to police someone's grief. Now, a word from our sponsors, followed by a few announcements.
This podcast is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me tell you a little more. It's a completely free service. They offer tools that allow you to create, record, and edit your podcast right from the convenience of your smartphone or computer. Additionally, Anchor will distribute your podcast on all major platforms, so it can be accessed on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can also earn income from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and they create personalized sponsorships. It's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. That's anchor.fm.
Thank you so much for listening. Like many other issues, this is not as polarizing as politics makes it out to be. But unfortunately, a lot of the changes we seek will have to come through political avenues. Please share far and wide, and as always, keep the pressure on your legislators so they actually act in your best interests. Give me a follow on Instagram at getwoke_die_trying so you can be privy to any updates, dialogue, make suggestions, and as of late, probably some reels as my comedic sacrifice to the Instagram algorithm. Thanks so much for your support, and I hope you'll tune in again next time.